اطلب العلم أخي فهو درب به نور به ترقى به تحيا عالما حرا فخور.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين وبعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Respected brothers and sisters and friends, welcome to the discussion and reading of Ad-Durr al-Mukhtar by Imam al-Haskafi rahimahullah wa radiya an. We read from Al-Buyu' وقال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا الله بعلومه آمين وإن باع صبرة على أنها 100 قافيز ب100 درهم وهي أقل أو أكثر أخذ المشتري الأقل بحصته إن شاء أو فسخ لتفرق الصفقة وكذا كل مكيل أو موزون ليس في تبعيضه ضرر. This mas'ala is discussing the principles of when the sale item does not match or is not congruent with what was agreed in the transaction. And so there can be many scenarios, and there's different types of sale items. And so the fuqaha want us to understand some principles, and those principles are relayed through these furu'. These furu' capture those usul which the fuqaha did bina of these masail. So in this first one, it's telling us that what the mas'ala is, that there were 100 qafiz, which is like a measure. So a subra, which is a heap, it was composed of 100 qafiz. That's the measure. You could call it whatever you want today. In lieu of 100 dirham. But then it turned out to be aqala akthar. It did not match. When they counted and realized what was there, it was either less or more. Then it's saying the mushtari will take when it's less accordingly, according to its price. So if there was 80 qafiz, the mushtari will pay 80 dirham. Or if he wants, he can cancel the transaction, right? Or fasakh. And the fuqaha mentioned now, why is this? So look, the first principle up here they're mentioning is an item which is singled out and is being sold. So up here, because every qafiz is being sold and is being equated, there's 100 qafiz for 100 dirham. Right? Now, if the buyer received 80, he'll pay 80. So the qafiz is being singled or equated to every single dirham. You can reduce the amount of payment because you know there's no jahala. If I was to reduce from 100 to 80 because there was only 80 qafiz present, then there's no jahala, nobody loses out. It's clear you're giving 80, you've equated 100 qafiz for 100 dirham. I will pay accordingly. Now, as the buyer, because I had agreed to 100 qafiz, that's what I was seeking in the market. That was what I wanted and needed. Because remember, the entire idea of bay is to fulfill the haja of both parties. The buyer has a haja to a particular item or a number of items. The seller has a need and haja to the price. That's what makes a sale. That both of them are exchanging what they need. So one party is exchanging in lieu of what they need, and the other party is exchanging in lieu of what they seek and need. So because I'm receiving less from this transaction, I can do fasq, because that's known as tafarruq al-safaqa. Remember this principle, tafriq al-safaqa by the fuqaha. This is another asal in muamalat, where whenever the outcome does not match, there's different scenarios the fuqaha talk of when referring to this principle of tafriq al-safaqa. One is when the ijab, there's no muwafaqa between ijab and qabul, right? That's one form of tafriq, where what's been offered and what's been agreed is different. Another is this, where what was agreed and what is delivered is different. This is also tafriq al-safaqa. It's as though you've split the transaction into two, or what was agreed was one transaction, what you're delivering is a different transaction. And because there's a principle in muamalat is whenever the counterparty does not gain exactly what was agreed to, or whenever there's a deficiency in taradi or rida, in the sense that it's not exactly as a mushtari or a buyer would have expected, or there's some kind of discrepancy between what they would have sought reasonably and what is being delivered, then that discrepancy or that deficiency is remedied through khiyar. Typically, it's those things which the jahala is not significant, it's minor, right? Because if the jahala, or if the issue is fahish, or the jahala is fahisha, then you can't remedy that just by khiyar. Okay, so khiyar comes when there's a deficiency less than intolerable jahala. It's tolerable, but just to ensure that the counterparty has complete satisfaction, a khiyar is typically placed. So up here, the first option is a form of khiyar, where the party can cancel the transaction. Then Imam al-Haskafi writes, commentating of course on Imam Tumurtashi's book, Tanwir al-Absar, he says, وَكَذَا كُلُّ مَكِيلٍ أو موزون ليس في تبعيضه ضرر. He says the same principle applies to every makil and mawzoon item. So every makil, it's measured by volume, mawzoon, weight. You can differentiate, you can separate, because the idea, what are the fuqaha trying to draw your mind to, is the principle that you can sort, you can separate, you can itemize things which can be separated and divided. And therefore, when that's the case, you can calculate a price at the end. There'll be no jahala as a consequence and as a result. Because if it was equated 100 for 100, we're equating every unit. And that's the word. When you can distinguish units of a thing, and you can equate a price to its units, then in the absence of an amount, you can recalculate the total. So in this example where we had agreed to 100, but there's only 80, because we're referring to units, qafiz, these units, and there's no darar, there's no harm to the sale item by separating the sale item and dividing the sale item. There's no darar. So you can do this. And so in any such product or any such sale item where we can make units, there's no harm in separating units. It's something which is sold as units. Typically, you'll pay according to how many there are. And if it was different to what was said, you can pay for what's there, or you can do fasq, right? Then they mention وَمَا زَادَ لِلْبَائِعِ لِوُقُوءِ الْعَقْدِ عَلَى قَدْرٍ مُعَيَّنٍ. If, however, so in the option where there's less, in that option, the buyer, the mushtari, will pay according to how much was presented and delivered. However, if there are more units, so 100 for 100 was agreed, but they turned out to be 120. Now, what was agreed is being delivered, but in addition to that, something extra is being delivered. What's the principle of that? The fuqaha, they mention whatever is excess is owned and belongs to the seller. It cannot be claimed by the buyer, the mushtari, because the transaction was on a particular amount which both parties had agreed to. The buyer, the mushtari, is receiving what he had agreed to and what he wanted. He is not being inconvenienced, or he is not being mistreated, or not satisfied with the transaction because it's received as he had agreed to. The excess was never part of the aqd. So the aqd wasn't 100 in the sale contract, in the sale and purchase agreement. It was only 100 mentioned. 120 are delivered. The 20 are not in the scope of the contract, and so they are surplus. The tamliq does not take place on the 20. Rather, the 20 have been given in the possession of the buyer. So there is an idhn in possession, but then because this is not something maqsudan, it wasn't given to the buyer intentionally, it was unintentionally, therefore the mushtari has to return it. The sale did not take place on the extra amount. It only took place upon the 100 that was there. And that is the principle, that what is mu'tabar is what is mentioned in the contract. Right? That's everything depends on what was agreed to, the amount, not what's given or what's like thought. I thought that this is the amount. No, what's actually mentioned is the deciding factor. So the extra amount, because it's not part of the mabi', it's not a mabi' in the first place. The excess, the 20 qafis which are extra, they're not the mabi'. When it's not the mabi', the milkiya does not transfer these. There's no tamliq in the 20. When there's no tamliq of the excess 20, it obviously then belongs to the owner, which is this, in this counterparty, these two parties, it was the seller. He owns the 20. He was not selling the extra 20 because his qabul or his ijab, depending whether he was buying or selling, did not equate to the extra 20. It did not encompass the extra 20. When he did not encompass the extra 20 remain his property throughout, and he will not be wronged, right? It's not part of the sale. So that's that principle up here. Okay, so whatever's not part of the sale item can never be sold. Or if something is not part of the sale, is delivered to the buyer mistakenly, they can't keep it, because the sale, for tamliq to take place, there has to be ijab and qabul, i.e. there has to be a bay'. A bay' does, the whole point of bay' and the athar of a bay' is tamliq. When tamliq is not addressed or is not referenced to or ascribed to a sale item, or when ijab and qabul is not referenced to a sale item, there is no transfer of ownership in that sale item. When there's no transfer of ownership in that sale item, the ownership of the asset remains with its owner. And that's what's happening up here. And so that's the idea and the asl up here of this fara. Then the fuqaha mention that وَإِن باع المذروع مثله على أنه 100 ذراع مثلا أخذ المشتري الأقل بكل الثمن أو ترك. Okay. That if a person was to now sell a madru, something which is measured like a cloth, fabric, similar, he sells 100 for 100, right? He says, I'm selling you 100 dhira, 100 centimeters, right? Ala annahu 100 dhira. So I'm selling you this item on the understanding that it's 100 centimeters, right? For 100 dirham. أخذ المشتري الأقل بكل الثمن أو ترك. In this scenario now, there's a difference. Why is there a difference? Because the asal underpinning this masala is different. Or this masala has shifted away from the previous asala we discussed. There's a difference between the two. In this scenario of the madhru, this fabric idea, the mushtari, the buyer, will take whatever is presented and he'll pay the full price. It will not be like the previous scenario where the buyer reduces and discounts the price to equate it to the amount of the sale item being delivered. Rather, the mushtari will take the cloth if he wants to keep the cloth, he'll take the cloth but pay the full price. Alternatively, because there's a discrepancy now, as we just mentioned, whenever there's a discrepancy and it's not fahish, the Sharia grants khiyar to ensure both parties have reached taradi, complete taradi, that there's no party should feel like they have lost out per se. So that khiyar is there just to patch up any deficiencies. And that's the beauty of Sharia. Okay. أو ترك إلا إذا قبض المبيع أو شاهده فلا خيار له لانتفاء الغرر. Except in the scenario where he took. Now, when will he not have this option of tarak and khiyar? Is when he's taken possession, meaning he's happy, he's taken it, he's happy with it. Oh, shahadahu, he's seen it, he's aware of it, he knows about it. There's no then minor gharar whatsoever. The gharar is completely removed because he was aware of the state when he took it. Okay. Now, why is this the case? Oh, let's finish this off. It says, look, وَأَخَذَ الْأَكْثَرْ بِلَا خِيَارِ الْبَائِعِ لأن الذرع وصف لتعيبه بالتبعيض ضد القدر والوصف لا يقابله شيء من الثمن إلا إذا كان مقصودا بالتناول كما أفاده بقوله. Now look, as this masala carries on. So look, there's a principle up here. He's saying that if there was more of this madru item and this cloth, this fabric, there was more than 100, he will take it and there'll be no khiyar for the seller. The seller will not have the right to object. Why is that the case? So the fuqaha now referencing a principle in fiqh here. This principle, the ta'alil, the fuqaha have debated in the ta'alil of this mas'ala or the bina of this mas'ala. What is the principle? Why did the imams of the madhab, what did the imams of the madhab radiyallahu anhum have in their mind when they were documenting these furu'? Okay, so there's two ta'alil that have been mentioned by the fuqaha under this. The first idea, and Ibn al-Humam rahimahullah has discussed this, he mentions the first is this concept of wasf and qadr. That's the first thing we have to understand. When the fuqaha use these terms, what do they mean? Or wasf and asal, right? It's or wasf and maqsood. There were items in those times which were sold. For example, you'd have fabric where the fabric would be like a roll. The precise measure was never the objective, rather just the fabric itself. And at times, such fabric would have one of two scenarios that the fuqaha mentioned. Either if you went to cut such a fabric, nobody would buy the individual pieces because the individual cuts were not really desired. They were of no use. So there were fabrics that were sold as one, and nobody was really concerned with the measure because the measure was meaningless. It was the fabric itself. It served a particular purpose as one fabric. And if you were to cut that fabric, it was almost meaningless. When it's meaningless, then there was darar in its tabi'id. That's one idea the fuqaha have mentioned in the ta'lil of this. That's why it's always kept as one. The item up here is sold as one, regardless of you saying it has 100 centimeters. The measure that you put is irrelevant, right? It's immaterial because these items which are madhru and the dhara is wasf. This measure is purely a wasf, meaning it's not the objective, it's not the fundamental requirement in the sale item. Rather, the sale item, this is just a secondary thing. The awsaf are secondary. It wasn't some, it just was a way to understand, okay, this is like 100 by 100, or 500 by 500, but that was not really the defining factor why a person would buy such a cloth. It wasn't that they would, strictly speaking, measure it to be exactly the case when selling. Rather, they were more concerned with the sale item itself or how it is, right? That was one notion. And that's one ta'lil up here. The second reasoning or second way the fuqaha describe this is, this refers to such clothing and fabric where the sides would be different. These cloths were either handmade and therefore there was discrepancy in the sides, in the way it was made. It wasn't as easy as, so it wasn't identical. When it's not identical, it's a jama' of so many different things into one. When that's the case, you do tab'id and you separate it, there'll be darar because the parts will be different. And therefore you could have jahala. Some parts could be better furnished than the other. And therefore, by you doing tab'id, of course there'll be darar, right? Because some people might want a certain piece and others might not want that certain piece. There could be a dispute in which piece or which part and which cut is part of the sale. So that's what is meant. So when we say it's a wasf, this dhara is a wasf, we are talking about such clothing where the cloth was sold as one, the measure and its kind of length, width wasn't really the objective, or it wasn't singled out as a deciding factor when purchasing. It wasn't labeled as such, right? The units were not singled out as the core upon which the transaction was built upon. And that's when that's the case, the dhara is a wasf. That's what the fuqaha are mentioning. It's a wasf, it's an adjective. When it's a wasf does not have the same i'tibar. That's why the fuqaha mention a principle, قد يجوز تبعا ما لا يجوز قصدا. If I recall correctly, Mullah Abdul Hayy rahimahullah, very famous scholar who passed away, 1370s? Not too long ago, 70, 80 years ago, written over 40, between 40 and 50 rasail, passes away at the tender age of 39, master, access to so many manuscripts, being able to add so much fawaid in his books. He mentions this principle in his Umdatul Ri'ayah, and this qaida which is found in other books of fiqh. قد يجوز تبعا ما لا يجوز قصدا, that sometimes certain things are permissible تبعا, which are not permissible qasdan. So and he gives many furu' there which capture this asal. And so he mentions the same idea. And so a dhara is wasf. It's not something which is, it's like taba'. There's no i'tibar of it. Okay, there's no i'tibar of taba'. It's something which is secondary, but the asal is the item. The maqsood is the item. The wasf is just like an adjective. For all intents and purposes, it's like an additional adjective or an irrelevant adjective. If you're describing something, the adjective is almost like secondary or tertiary. It has no meaning or consequence to the interest of the buyer. Rather, it is the sale item itself which captures the interest of the buyer. This wasf and this description or this adjective is purely immaterial, insignificant, inconsequential. And therefore, in this here, the fuqaha mentioning that dhara is purely a wasf. Wasf doesn't have, it's not something which people equate even a price to. لا يقابله شيء من الثمن. It's not something which changes the price because it's immaterial, it's inconsequential in those times. People were just after the cloth. They were not really worried, concerned with, oh yeah, it's 1 centimeter less, 1 centimeter more. Those questions were meaningless because the cloth was there in front of them. It was one that is what they wanted. However, the fuqaha mentioned that's the qiyas, or that's the principle up here. However, إلا إذا كان مقصودا بالتناول. However, when a scenario is created, or when there's a situation where the unit itself, the wasf adjective becomes material, it becomes significant. People begin to take this seriously and make the transaction revolve around these awsaf, such that they become the maqsood, then yes, it will be meaningful. And so then this wasf will then be treated as an asl, it will be treated as a unit. And just as we mentioned earlier, if there's less, you pay accordingly. If there was more delivered and the contract was upon a particular amount, the excess will go to the seller, right? It'll belong to him. So they mention, so that's the principle, okay? That's the principle when it comes to this issue of dhara. Then the fuqaha mention, وَإِنْ قَالَ فِي بَيْعِ الْمَذْرُوعِ, if it was said, كُلَّ ذِرَاعٍ بِدِرْهَمٍ أخذ الأقل بحصته لصيرورته أصلا بإفراده بذكر الثمن أو ترك لتفريق الصفقة. Exactly as we mentioned, then the moment you give every single unit you single out every single unit and you make it the foundation upon which the transaction is made. It's part of the actual description of the sale item that the first thing, it's 100 units. That is what's being bought. It's not a fabric which happens to be X amount. Rather, you are being sold 100 centimeters of this particular cloth. That's the pivot and the center, the focal point of the transaction. That's the key desirable and deliverable in this transaction. And so when the parties do ifrad, they single it out. The unit is mentioned specifically, it becomes a asl. It's the sale item now. The units become the sale item. It's not a taba anymore. It's rather the asl. And therefore, when that's the case, he can take according, if it's less, he'll take accordingly, he'll pay accordingly. Or because there's a deficiency, he can walk away and cancel. He'll have his khiyar because it's tafriq al-safaqa. What he had agreed to and what's being delivered to him are two different things. وكذا أخذ الأكثر كل ذراع بدرهم أو فسخ لدفع ضرر التزام للزائد. Likewise, when there's more offered, he'll pay for the extra. Okay, he'll pay for the extra, or he'll have a choice. You don't have to take it. You can walk away, or you buy according to what's being offered. So if there's 120 now, he can pay 120. Okay. But if there's he won't be forced to buy the extra because that's harm upon him. Why would he be forced? He never entered the transaction seeking 120, but there's 120 now. So when there's more, it's not part of the sale contract. Rather, the extra, he'll pay an additional amount. Again, the fuqaha are doing daf'u darar here. That's the key idea, because a person, you can't do iltizam. A person can only do iltizam. You can't do ilzam upon somebody of something in a mu'awada. So you can't do ilzam. But a person can do iltizam. Iltizam is done by him opting for it. So if a person opts for something, he does iltizam himself, that's acceptable. But if there was ilzam up here where he's now forced to buy 120, whereas he had agreed to buy only 100, that's ilzam. Right? That ilzam is creating an iltizam. Like it's forcing the buyer to commit to this additional amount, which he himself had not committed to. And that's not acceptable in Sharia, because every party is only in a contract bound to buy or commit to what they do iltizam of. And that comes from the idea of taradi. Okay. And it's also to do with protecting the wealth of the transacting parties and prevent from aklu amwalin nas bil batil, because this would be a form of aklu amwalin nas bil batil if a person without taradi he's made to transact more. That's why taradi is there to counter aklu amwalin nas bil batil. Then the fuqaha mentioned وقد بيع عشرة أذرع من 100 ذراع من دار من دار أو حمام وصححاه وإن لم يسمي جملتها على الصحيح لأن إزالتها بيدهما. Okay. Up here now, there's another mas'ala. The mas'ala is saying that وفسد, it'll be fasid. Okay. It'll be up here وفسد, right? It's not وقد, it's actually وفسد بيع عشرة. So there's a mistake in the actual um, Dar Kutub Ilmiya print up here. So not surprising, but up here it's not وقد بيع, it's وفسد بيع عشرة أذرع. So the sale transaction of 10 dhira from 100 dhira would be fasid according to Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah. According to Imam Abu Hanifa, if you sell 10 dhira from 100 from 100 dhira of a house or hammam, like a bath, then it'll be fasid. Whereas according to Sahibain, they said it'll be valid, okay, even if you don't mention the full amount, according to Sahibain, or how much the total is. So out of 100 zira, right? They don't mention, but you just mention 10 or 20. According to Sahibain, it's valid. Now, why is so? There's the bina and the basis of the Imma Thalath is different. Imam Sab rahimahullah bases this masala upon, he looks and he says, look, there's a clash between haqiqah and majaz up here. And then there's another principle layered further down, which is the haqiqah leading to jahala? So there's layers and tiers to this mas'ala. The immediate thing is Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, he's saying the word appear dhira really refers to the khashaba, because that's the mawsuf. This dhira is just a sifa. Nobody buys a sifa. Sifa is just an abstract concept. Rather, people buy what's underlying, or the mawsuf, the actual item, which is khashaba. So you're buying 10 khashaba, 10 planks from 100 planks of a house, or 10 panels from 100 panels of a house, or a public bath, right? Or not even just a private bath, right? It doesn't have to be public. It can just be a private bath. And this kind of like shower facility. So you're buying just 10 pieces from there. So according to Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, this is majaz. The word adru is majaz, the word dhira is majaz. What's meant is a khashaba. And when the khashaba is meant, then the next tier is, okay, which khashaba are you buying? Is it from the front, the back, the sides? Because the khashaba were different and they were used for different things. There's different types, different strengths. Some were weaker than the other because they were used more, or were more in, you could say, exposure to usage. And therefore the quality of the khashaba and the planks and the these wooden pieces, they differed. When there was a difference in them, there's jahala. And when there's jahala, which is potentially mufdi ila niza', which would be the case here, as there's clear differences in the value of the planks and the its kind of health and its you could say, and its wear and tear, then that would more than likely lead to niza'. This whole debate on, look, which jahala leads to niza', it's all about probability, right? It works on the spectrum of probability, where there's an assumption of something being material and it's more probable and likely for it to lead to niza, that issue and that jahala becomes fahisha. Where the probability is less, then it's not going to lead to niza, it will not be fasid. Now, how do we then understand that? How do we operationalize that? It's operationalized by looking in the market. It requires understanding the urf of this, like test it in the market. Typically, would this lead, if there's two reasonable parties, how would they respond to this particular thing? It would be tested in the market. The market would be a test for this itself. In the absence of a test in the market, and when the law is being written or when it's cited, the principle is mentioned. And if there is a clear discrepancy between, or a very possible, where there's multiple differences in what's being offered, I mean, the more numbers, the more possibilities. The more possibilities there are, then the more probable there'll be dispute. And the less possibility of, or the less numbers, the less kind of like discrepancies, there's less possibilities, it likely be less dispute. But that's not qaida kulliya, because you can have just two things which are completely different and that can lead to this dispute. It's just a weight. It's actually the spectrum of difference between the things. How different are they? Like in the market, amongst people, how consequential and how material are the differences? Are they given different values? Are they significant values? Because this is more about economic value, talking about a use case and benefit. These are the kind of like indicators. It's economic value, it's use cases. These two, right? I would say are potentially the key driving factors up here. Now, if there's discrepancies between the units, in terms of value and in terms of uses, then definitely it'll cause niza, more than likely. Or there's an assumption it'll cause a niza, hence the fuqaha will immediately ban such an action and say it's fasid, because it's likely to cause that. So Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah was of this view, that this is what is meant. Sahibain rahimahumullah said, no, it's valid, this practice can work. The reason why they mention this is because they say, look, appear the haqiqa is meant, not majaz. When you're saying dhira, you're selling dhira. They considered it to be identical to the masla of selling the ashum, the shares of a property or something, right? Where there'd be shuyur as a result. Whereas according to Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, in this masla, there's no shuyur. You're actually buying 10 specific planks. According to Sahibain, you're actually buying 10 dhira from 100 dhira. So it's like you're buying a share, a percentage of the property. That's how they've understood this. And therefore, there is no jahala, because you're buying, it's all in front of you, you're buying 10% from here. Whereas according to Imam Abu Hanifa, because the haqiqa was meant, haqiqa means you're buying an ain, you're buying specific planks of wood. When you're buying specific planks of wood and the sale item has multiple planks of wood, there's different planks in this actual building, this 100 dhira. Therefore, there's dispute. Which 100 dhira? What I choose will be different to what you deliver. And what you want to give will be different to what I want to receive. When that's the case, it's jahala and it's niza. So they mention, carrying on from here, the fuqaha mention لا يفسد بيع 10 أسهم من 100 سهم لشيوع السهم لا الذراع. Okay, so the fuqaha are mentioning that if you were to purchase 10 shares from 100 shares, then it will not, according to everybody, right? According to everybody, if you were to buy 100 shares, 10 shares from 100 shares, which have shuyur. What does shuyur mean? Shuyur means that every plank of wood, every dhira is co-owned. You're buying 10% from all the planks of wood. That's what the shiu usam. Or up here, if you're buying ashum, we're talking about ashum, right? In the context of ashum and shares, you are buying 10 shares in every single atom of the sale item, you're getting 10% stake. That's what's meant here. Now, again, the ibara up here, there's a mistake here, and this copy is just not ideal. So, لا يفسد بيع 10 أسهم من 100 سهم اتفاقا لشيوع السهم لا الذراع. بقي, so this is according to Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, this is لا الذراع. The fuqaha, the later fuqaha have mentioned that Sahibain's qawl is ma'mul bihi, and fatwa is given on Sahibain's qawl because it's based on urf and understanding, and people have done amal upon Sahibain's qawl. It's become normalized. It's not leading to niza'. This practice has become normal of them buying, selling this type of transactions. Rafi'i mentioned this also, that it is the ma'mul bihi, right? That Sahibain's understanding is practiced upon. And that's why the text is actually mentioning Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah's view. بقي, there's now one point is mentioned up here. بقي لو تراضيا على تعيين الأذرع في مكان لم أره. Okay, he's mentioning a point up here that, okay, what if they, according to Imam Abu Hanifa, because this whole idea of jahala, we don't know which part is being sold, if the two parties were to come together and say, you know what, I'm buying actually this point here, will this satisfy? Will this be sufficient in terms of rectifying the problem? Okay, so he's saying, look, I've not really seen this mentioned by the fuqaha, but he says وينبغي انقلابه صحيحا لو في المجلس ولو بعده فبيع التعاطي. He's saying it should be acceptable based on the principles if it's in the majlis or after, then by بيع التعاطي. Now, he's mentioning up here, he's mentioning that why this would be acceptable. He's saying it will, because it's rectifying. You're rectifying, you're removing in the majlis al-aqd the jahala, and whilst you're in the majlis you can rectify the jahala. There is a difference in a dispute between whether, according to Imam Abu Hanifa's principles, if you were to resolve this after the sale item, and whether it be deemed as bay'ut ta'ati, right? Which we will discuss inshallah next week. So we'll stop here. We'll continue from this point of bay'ut ta'ati. Subhanallah bihamdihi, subhanaka, nashhadu la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.